All right, this one is going to be exceptionally long. I've got a lot of notes from the reading. A reading I did find very close to me because I do believe I'm fairly dependent on my cell phone. Obviously, you can pin it as addiction, but by now I'm sure that's probably a term. Basically, it starts with the author surveying a bunch of people and interviewing professionals um, about smartphone habits. He found that a lot of us, although we already know, um, obviously still struggle with it. He also found that like religious and political views, they shape who we are personally, and that smartphones are like a window into our soul and a reflection of who we truly are. Now, there was a correlation found that dependency normally equals higher usage rates, and he'd rather not call it addiction, and that was emphasized many times throughout the text that addiction isn't the right words to use for that. Using Judson Brewer's words, he defines addiction's continued use despite adverse consequences. You can see that drugs and alcohol. Yet technology doesn't really share that same fate. There's a spectrum, and it's determined by living condition. Obviously, your spectrum of how much you use technology. How do we distinguish between normal use and use with bad outcomes? That was a major point because you cannot really say what a bad outcome is with technology, especially considering 2 minutes of usage time could be that compared to 20, so you can't really put a time label on that either. To that, he basically determined that the severity of usage determines the adverse effects. Also, that the term smartphone addiction is more derogatory than it is helpful in solving this. There is no definition at the time. I don't know now, but in 2017 to 2018, the DSM, which is like what psychiatrists use to evaluate people, there was no definition for smartphone addiction. Um, Better yet, people have tried to, but we're humans. We know it's wrong. We know what we're doing is wrong, and we determine that either way, whether it's correct or not, we don't care. We're just going to do it anyway. So getting that defined as addictive is probably never going to happen. Um, There are computer use addiction disorders, but that is described as a human machine dynamic rather than a chemical dynamic. It's hard to even start to diagnose. Everybody would be an addict, basically. Same with the workforce, due to protection laws. They already assume that, oh, they're all addicts, but there is no real definition of addiction, so it didn't really make much sense. Drugs and smartphones should not be grouped together. That was a big point. They talked about drugs later on, too, probably around page 19 through like 25 is a lot about how dopamine affects our brains. Apps are built to abuse the human brain. I mean, it's a slot machine that's also mentioned later in the text. It is built to play on this, to continue us to use the app to make them money. It's psychotic, honestly, and manipulative. Um, but the term pharmotronic um, was thrown around, which is addiction starts with the tech, not the user, which is now argued saying it's a personal choice, but overlooks the tech's addictive qualities. Um, it makes the point that it's not necessarily an addiction, but an overdependency on this technology. At this point, um, it goes over. I don't want to say he. I know it's you, but you go over the three different forms of habit like things. So habits, compulsions, and addictions. Habits are repetitive, not necessarily harmful. Compulsions can cause harm, and stuff like that. OCD, it wasn't necessarily said OCD, but the checking the locks thing, obsessive compulsive disorder, and then addiction, which is like compulsions but way worse and have way more adverse effects. The smartphone use can be impulsive or habitual, um, but can become uncontrollable, which is normally what addiction is. This idea was thrown around a lot in this article, which is, I'm going to say now, the more you use your smartphone, the more you're going to want to use your smartphone, which creates more of an addiction to your smartphone. So it's kind of like a never-ending loop. And what better to that than to say that worldwide smartphone use and just smartphone use in general is just going to keep increasing. I mean, it's just going to keep getting worse. I feel like this is kind of a silent sleeper attacking not just Americans, but the human population in general, to the point where we're probably going to be extremely dependent on technology where we couldn't live on it in the next couple of years. The term smartphone dependency was used, that in place of the word addiction. It's not addiction because that term is fairly derogatory and counterproductive to the study of addiction and cause people to close up. They don't want to talk about it. Um, you also make the point that, or sorry, you don't. Greenfield believes that not all usage is bad and only 6% is unmanageable. Terrible. So that's a big point to add to this unmanageability, but undiagnosed addiction, but not addiction. It's complicated. Another thing, smartphones have spread in general as a technology faster than any technology has in this world. Within 10 years, probably a fourth of the human population is owned. Probably more than that, probably 50, 60% of the population was owned from 2006 or 7 or whenever the first one was released to 2017. I feel like that's a big important statistic. They did try to do self-reports on addiction. The only issue is self-bias. Most people are not going to agree with that. Um, and reference bias. So, like, yeah, I have a problem, but it's not as bad as this guy who does it more, like, still kind of ignoring the fact that there's a problem there. That's really big, especially in human culture in general. By that, I mean, yeah, we dropped the nuke, but this guy dropped a hydrogen bomb. I mean, like, it's still not okay either way. They also mention multitasking. When you're surveying for if you feel distracted in class, people say, no, I multitask. It's the opposite, but psychologically, multitasking does the opposite. So you're actually just distracting. So that gives you an imbalance of your information that you're going to receive. I mean, that's what I read. I've taken psychology. It's also part of course. Now, to combat this, they did an 11 question survey. Instead of doing yes, no, or whatever, they did an X. And instead of telling them what all this meant, they were just like, how many X's equals the severity of your um, dependency on technology. Now, after all this, the surveys and stuff, 45% of people said they were addicted to technology, while female being the most open to say so, which makes sense because men are very stubborn and, probably gonna lie. Uh, but I don't believe that's probably true because I believe further on they say only like, I mean, even before 6% was only unmanageable. Like the confusion of habitual use and compulsive use to addiction is completely different. And this type of addiction can't be quantified like marijuana or alcohol. You can't describe it in ounces or grams or anything. So it's hard to track that usage to even say addiction to start. Um, the next thing they mention is unlike other things like overeating and stuff like that, where you see immediate results, there is no measurable immediate result or result in general, at least through one use or two uses that you could say is significantly bad. Overeating, you could tell you start to gain weight, but psychologically, you can't tell normally until you've already developed a thing. So it's normally a slower eating psychological development of diseases, mental health disorders, not diseases. Now, what I found interesting is that they had allowed video game disorder. It's not the exact name for it, but video game addiction, and how I feel that is extremely similar to technological use, but they use that as like a pillar to represent what could be the same confines that would diagnose addiction, smartphones, because I mean that's pretty similar. They made a definite good point that smartphones might be an amplifier amp rather than the direct um, influence on these issues. So instead of it creating the issues, it just makes issues worse, at least psychologically. Now it comes to the Columbine, I don't remember how you say it. I remember hearing about it a lot as a kid, before, like, obviously the mass shootings that happened when I got older. But they used that video games had an effect on these children to go shoot up a school, which is later deemed not to necessarily be true. But they were playing Doom, and that like made the whole world blow up about the worries about video games, which honestly spread all the way up. I haven't really heard anything about it until 2018, maybe 2020, but I remember there's a whole study about it, and they, at least now, they found it completely to be inverse. But in the text, they believe that rather creating these issues in people, it just speeds it up, kind of like a catalyst. Going back to that, they said it was less the content of the game, but the person who was playing it. Now, this sprung the idea, at least in the text next, of techno self, which is an extension of yourself, technologically, but it's more like you are so codependent on your technology that it becomes a part of you. Um, and if that's how it is, then we should start treating technology as a part of us as well, rather than a toy or a tool. Now they go on to this story about a 13-year-old kid and his mom. Um, the mom takes the phone for a whole year, starts a bunch of fights throughout the house, but at the end, the kid really thanks them. And they mention how, like, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there's parents that have heard this everywhere, and they, oh, I'm gonna try this. But for people with severe codependency and people normally, that will not go well. That will just cause a lot more issues. And they mentioned that. Devora, I believe this is Hunter, said doing something like this, saying it's for their own good, causes kids to not open up about how they have mental health issues in the future. Mainly just because the family's, oh, it's for your good, you're good, when they don't know. That's just not true. Again, it was mentioned that the term addiction could do the adverse of trying to approach somebody about it. Now, a lot of people feel addicted, but most might not be due to the fact that they're only using it to get gratification from their phone rather than seeking every moment of your life to be on that device. Um, Now, I've learned this before. I talked about it in my film studies class, the slot machine example, which was presented in the text. Companies like Instagram and all of them, the swipe pull down method to really keep people hooked. It's a response, a stimuli that continues to stimulate your brain to continue to want to keep doing it, doing it, doing it, doing it. Later on, they talk about stuff you learn in psychology, which is the op operational stimulant, I believe, and then the classical stim or classical whatever. Oh yeah, conditioning. Sorry. Which is like just teaching the dog example, even teaching a dog when it's time for dinner and when to wait and stuff like that. It's kind of how apps train our brains. Now for the slot machine example that they were presenting, it's more you check your phone and boom, you have a notification, or you don't have a notification. Either way, it's still going to stimulate your brain and cause you to want to do it again, and do it again, and do it again. This is obviously positive and negative reinforcement. But one more thing before that is they mentioned checks. Obviously, checks just looking at your phone. But they mentioned how the smartphone, I mean, Apple tracks now. I don't know if they did in 2017, but how it tracks your checks by only unlocking the phone rather than it having every time you like look at it. Now, they mentioned how this habit can cause night checking, and what that means is waking up middle of the night checking your phone and then causing sleep disruptions, which could cause sleep disorders, and it's just not good. And it is increasing in our generation. I mean, I could say I've woken up a couple times to go to the bathroom, check what time it is, see how much more time I have left to sleep. In very few instances, they mention that, you get on your phone, you're on social media, and you're doing a bunch more than what you just intended on doing when you got there. Now, just as I said, oh, I was checking the time, and then bang, I get a notification or something, and I'm on my phone for 2 hours. They have a study done, I guess say less a study, but information presented that the sorry, once you have an original task, you can be doing it and doing it and doing it, and then you get a secondary notification, a text message, a message from an app or something else, and that tends to sidetrack your original task. And the statistic they give you is that it can delay your task up to 400%, um, which makes sense because you can get really strung into a lot of apps and a lot of information. Back to the kind of that slot machine idea, the author compares kind of just not even owning a smartphone, but just using a smartphone to like a casino. We have the option to stop whenever we want, but most of the time we tend on going further than we ever intended. With like, say I want this 1 hour slot to using my phone. You're probably going to go over that by 30 minutes, 45 minutes, normally way longer than you intended naturally. Um, Now there was a crazy statistics that was in the chat the article that was we check our phones 2,617 times a day. Just touch it, not like open it or everything. Now, granted, that could just be like you picking up the phone, all that stuff, but like that's a lot, and that kind of leads into later where we're just doing redundant checks. Like we know there's nothing there. I mean, they have down here we check it in like the median 80 times a day to 100, and or sorry, the mean, and like we're not always checking for something. A lot of the time we're just checking without even knowing. We're just checking for that slot machine advantage where, oh, is there going to be something there? If not, then no, you're screwed. Now the next thing, it's a little bit out of order because I jumped ahead a little bit, but you mentioned eating and watching TV while being on the phone. I feel like that's definitely a Generation Z thing. Using your phone while eating, I feel like everybody does now. Every single person. That statistic from 68%, I believe it is. Um, or sorry, 65. I don't know. It was 60. 60% of us do it. No, it's probably more like 80 or 90% of us use our phones at some point during a dinner. Now, the next statistic within that same kind of paragraph sentence is that 82% of the 202 people that he surveyed opened their phone or checked it for no reason, which goes back to the redundancy later where we check our phones over 100 times a day, and not every time it's going to have something to do with it. With more statistics, 63.8, I believe, percent of people check their phone first things in the morning. Now, some people go on and say, "Oh, yeah, I'm doing it because I want to check my clock." But then they just go from their clock to another app. And then okay, let me say this right. Variable interval reinforcement plays a key role in the obsession. It's just like at different times you're on your phone, you get a different notification, which is like a reward. So not knowing how long you're going to be on the phone creates like a habit of doing it in general, but makes you want to do it more so you can get that random notification, a random thing that you've been waiting for, random whatever, because it's not going to be guaranteed. You don't know when somebody's going to reply. You don't know when you're going to get a notification from an app. You don't know any of that. And the most addictive part about that is the unpredictability that that causes. Now we go into the chemical side of it, which dopamine. I mean, I have ADHD. Now it's proven to be an imbalance in the brain. When this was written, it was just kind of a theory. Um, but yeah, it dopamine in this case is not derived directly from using the device, but more the seeking responses and notifications and getting those or not getting those that creates dopamine. It's the seeking part of our brain, not the receiving part of our brain. Now, the dopamine response was similarized to that of doing drugs. Um, but the author then said that that was just like an oversimplification of it because it's a little bit more in depth than that. And unlike drugs, which directly give you pleasure or whatever you want to call it, the um, technology is more of a random. It goes back to the seeking feature, and getting rewarded through that. It's not necessarily pleasure, but the thrill of doing it. Now, a big part about this, the fear of missing out or FOMO, which only gets worse by not or by missing out, not using your phone. It's complex and it's not just a dopamine thing where, I know this now. We're happy. It's also a social cultural thing. We're like, oh man, you don't know about this. What's wrong with you? How do you not know about this? This happened 2 weeks ago. You're supposed to know about this. And the seeking, um, constantly through our phones, causes a very weird and complex relationship with our brains. Something that we probably can't even comprehend totally, just because we can't like see into our brains. Now, a theory they did provide was if tech is causing chemical imbalances in the brain like ADHD, then they could just make medicine for it. And I feel like at the time, that was more of a developing thing, but now I feel like that was completely disregarded because I don't believe it can change something in your brain permanently. If it's something more, it's probably like a drug that only does it for a couple, say 30 minutes to an hour. Now, a big thing that was talked about was psychosis, um, and that versus dependency, like the differences, because they share a lot in common. I'm not even gonna lie, they share so much in common. And there's many points made out through the article that continued like slowly implementing parts of it. Like this is a part of psychosis, like the improper sleep and the thinking and everything like that. And that was just continued through the text. They also mentioned that like it may be a bit of an over exaggeration of saying that, but it's still a thing, and that cannot be overlooked. Now starts the physical effects on the body. Quoting Ramonzini, a publication he made, which this man basically made OSHA. Like he got all the guidelines and everything, started exposing industries for having poor stuff in their systems. It kind of goes over the effects that these technologies have had on our bodies over the last, say, at that time in 2017, the last 30 years. Now, a big point he made that repetitive motions, like in his examples for carpal tunnel syndrome, the typewriter, or not typewriter, I'm sure that was a thing too, but like keypads and everything can cause um, carpal tunnel syndrome. Eventually, this was disproved later on. More hereditary factors use technology as like an enzyme to catalyze it to cause these things to happen faster. Or rheumatoid arthritis or rheumatoid arthritis was one of those examples. And especially people in steel mills, they thought it was a lot of office workers. It wasn't. It was more of the like the blue collar jobs, I guess you could say. Um, and this was just like the video game conversation, which kind of came to an abrupt end. The second anything happens, like it was 1 year where it was really big, it's computer's fault. It's video games' fault this kid shot up a school. It's the phone's fault why we're all different. No, it's an individualized and personal. It's everybody's fault. You these things do not make us do stuff. They don't tell us to do stuff. it's all a choice, and by continuously choose to use this technology, these symptoms and stuff are going to get worse. It's going to cause things like that to happen. Now, I find them funny, but the two things they gave as an example to the Italians writing was text neck. That wasn't to the Italians writing. That was another man's research, which was just prolonged use of your neck like this, which I believe said adds 60 pounds to your spine, leaning in forward, which is way more than your head gives. And the other thing was screen vision problems from looking at screens uh, all day. I mean that was a pretty big part of it. And then nomophobia, the fear without phone. I feel like that's probably a problem for a good 20% of the population. Um, it can be bad, but in the end, he basically just ends it off saying technology can be bad, but we don't know if it is. Um, and more necessarily, we don't know if it will be. And it can also not be. It's kind of complicated.